Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
I'm Brandon Bernstein.
No relation.
Hey, Henry, we are back.
Yeah, and it didn't even take 6 months to say that.
Yeah, it's really exciting to what would it take us, a month since the last episode?
Yeah.
Maybe a little more, something like that.
Time to talk about comics.
Time once again to talk about comics. You know, you mentioned last time, Henry, that you were feeling a little not burnt out, but sort of like we'd maybe come to an end, and all of a sudden you were reinvigorated by some of what we found. And new to all of our listeners is the fact that we found a little more along the same theme. Last time we did a Marvel deep dive into Captain America's Jewish friends. And so how about we look at some DC Jewish friends?
This is like the episode I've been waiting for. I've been however many we've done. It's like finally my time to shine.
Finally, it's Henry's time to shine. All super mentions, this is your call, because we are diving into the Kryptonians themselves, the start of the superhero movement as we know it. We are looking at Jewish supporting characters within the pages of both Supergirl and the big boy himself,
Superman. I'm so happy to be talking about Superman. I can't tell you.
You're wearing the appropriate shirt and celebration and everything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Wearing the crest of Al, of the House of Al.
From the House of David to the House of Al.
I guess when we were talking last time about Captain America, and I was feeling kind of like, well, how much more is there to say? And then, we found this treasure trove of Captain America issues, which, as I've asked around the comic book community, apparently it was pretty well known that this was a thing that happened. And, people from about 10 years older than us who were reading comics in the 70s and 80s, it was like, yeah, Bernie Rosenthal, Captain America's Jewish girlfriend. So, right. so that's kind of interesting. But I really thought we would never have an opportunity to talk about Superman. Our whole premise for this, which we talked about from episode 1, is that like these creators were all Jewish with very Jewish stories, American Jewish stories, and European Jewish stories. But there's nothing Jewish in the pages, and like you don't get more Jewish than Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in terms of cultural identity in 1938 for two 19-year-olds. But again, we haven't seen much in the pages of those comics. So I was so excited to find both something from Supergirl and then from Superman. It's great.
Yes, and just like my parents would make me do on Hanukkah when I wanted to open all the presents the first night and they tried to instill patience in me, we're going to delay the gratification of Superman himself just a little longer, and we'll start with Supergirl, because it turns out in the 1980s, she also had some Jewish neighbors. In this case, we're going to be looking at Mrs. Berkowitz and a rather disturbing supervillain by the name of Blackstarr. So these are our Jewish characters we're diving into. Henry, you want to tell us what our first issue is?
Yeah, we are looking at Supergirl Volume 2, number 13, November 1983. Echoes of Time Gone By, written by Paul Kupperberg, penciled by Carmine Infantino, inked by Bob Oksner, colored by Tim Ziuko, lettered by Ben Oda, and edited by Julius Schwartz, of course. This is great. This was actually collected in 2 trades about 5 years ago, and I bought it, and I was like, oh, great. I've never read this very short series it's about 24 issues, this very short series from the 80s. I'm going to check it out. And like right away, there's a Jewish character. And I was so excited. This is before you and I were talking about this, but it was not that much before.
That's so exciting. You get to dive back into it and see it. We've had a lot of conversations about the Jewish content we read when we were young, and it just like somehow missed. We weren't thinking through this lens.
Right. But and this time I didn't miss it. Like I saw it, I clocked it. I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah, you're able to bring it up and say, Supergirl has this Jewish neighbor. But you started to talk about it, but just to give a little bit of context for us, is there anything we should know about Supergirl Volume 2? Where are we in DC history? What is going on? Like, what is going to ground us in the story?
That is the nicest thing you've ever asked me, to give you ask you where we are in DC history. This is 1983, so this is pre-crisis, which means that is the universe with Earth 1 and 2, Earth 2, multiple universes, going back to 1938 when Superman first debuted. And this is considered the Bronze Age. So this is the end of that. The crisis on Infinite Earths is about to happen. For about 30 years, Supergirl was like Superman's young cousin that didn't get to do much and was like a side character, or in like the Superman family comics, like all throughout the 50s and 60s. So she gets her own series here. She moves to Chicago to go to college, and until this point she had like been in an orphanage and kind of diminutive, and here was sort of like a big deal, like woman of the 80s going to seek her fortune in Chicago. So that's where we are. I probably said more than I needed to, but
no, it was great. It was so wonderful to hear that. I actually, even though I knew it, I know Crisis is 1986, if I'm remembering correctly, or 85
85
maybe?
And Superman is rebooted in 86.
Okay, so that's where I was getting it from. So this comic's from 1983, but for some reason in my mind, I was like, clearly this must be a post-crisis. We're getting into the 80s, but we're actually really helpful to remember this is before that.
This would be like at the same time as like the new Teen Titans by Wolfman and Perez is huge. Like
great,
the DC answer to Marvel's X-Men at the time, right? Like you can picture where you are in like 1983 with the X-Men. So this is like DC. That's like the big thing happening in DC. So it was like a big deal for Supergirl to get her own book in which she was doing something modern and adult. Until this point, since her invention, she had been like a kid basically. So
wow.
that's where we are.
And she has, unfortunately, a rather difficult, not entry into adulthood, but boy, she is entering adulthood. She is not pulling any punches in terms of dealing with some of the difficulties. We're starting off right away on page 5 with her neighbor. This is Mrs. Berkowitz, and Mrs. Berkowitz reveals that sometime the day or the night before, her door had been defaced with a swastika. So we've seen this before in a few comics, but we basically have, not for the first time in our series, Nazi graffiti defacing a Jewish home or place of worship. It's unfortunately common in real life in terms of an example of anti-Semitism. But Mrs. Berkowitz is sharing it with her neighbors, and she has another neighbor, this woman named Joni, who's trying to assure Mrs. Berkowitz it's just some stupid kid's joke, to which Mrs. B gives us an incredible response. A joke? That's what we said in Poland almost 50 years ago. Who's going to hurt us? This is our country. We belong here. They didn't care that we belonged. They took us, crammed us into boxcars like animals, branded us like cattle. And as she shows Joni the numbers on her arm, on her wrist, marking her as a survivor of the camps, sent us to living hells where they killed you in their showers, or worse, let you live to die a little day by day. Joni responds saying, I know. And then an incredible response, Mrs. B, just like not letting Joni rest for a moment. You don't know, child. Nobody who wasn't there could. At first, it was just the work of a small group of madmen, but the maddest of them all became master of a country. And because he decreed the Jews must die, millions did. Millions. And my Rachel and Jaime. Oof. So like right away, I mean, I'm sure that as you were saying, we've seen this character in earlier issues, but suddenly we're just struck with the immediacy of how this defacement of her door brings her back to some very direct loss. Mrs. Berkowitz is, like Anna Kappelbaum, a survivor of the Shoah, a survivor of the Holocaust, and she lost direct family members. She lost her husband and daughter. One piece I do want to make sure to bring up, in that monologue, she was talking about how she and the other Jews in Poland felt like, this is our country, we belong here. And I know in my own experience in rabbinical school, we would often have conversations in history classes of, is the American Jewish experience actually unique, or is it just the latest in many Jewish experiences, meaning the Jews of Spain in the Golden Age of Spain, they felt at home in Spain in a very significant way. The Jews of Germany in the 20th century felt at home in Germany in a very significant way. And I don't bring that up to say, who knows what could happen in the US with anti-Semitism, but rather to say, from our vantage point, we view it as, wow, Poland, what a terrible place for Jews, because we know the ending of the story. But the reality is, there was incredibly rich Jewish history in Poland for roughly 1,000 years preceding the Holocaust. There were 900 to 1,000 years of rich history with certainly highs and lows, but some of those highs were incredible. Early Jewish communities in Poland would refer to the country as Polin, which is actually from the Hebrew words po and lean. Po here, lean to rest or lodge. So in other words, Polin is like rest here. This is the country where we can rest. This is the land where we can be. It's also the name of the Polin Museum, a museum in Warsaw that is dedicated to the history of the Jewish community within Poland. And looking at the history, I went on a trip back when I worked at Northwestern, and I led some students on an alternative break trip to Poland, and we spent time at that museum. It was incredible. It opened originally in 2013, and I cannot find the origin of this, but I really could have sworn that there was once a folk belief that the Polish Jews loved Poland so much that they believed that if the Messiah ever came and a third temple was built, that literally pieces of Poland would float up into the sky and move over to the land of Israel and join with the land of Israel. That's how important Poland was to the Jewish community there. It was not just a place to live. They were every bit as integrated with the land and with living there as we are today. There was maybe not as great relations, again, depending on the era, between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors, but certainly Poland was home to these Jews. Mm-hmm. And that is how Mrs. Berkowitz felt in the 1930s. As we continue on, Mrs. Berkowitz mentions that this is not an isolated incident. There's actually been a rash of these graffiti markings across Chicago. And because of that, she's worried that it's happening again. It, of course, being the Holocaust. So on page 12, Supergirl finally enters into things. She comes home from an adventure and turns on the TV to discover a news report about this wave of anti-Semitism that has indeed been sweeping Chicago. There are instances of synagogue vandalism, harassment of homeowners, and Supergirl is upset. Henry, could you read for us what it is that she says upon seeing this news report?
My first instinct is to go and smash the people responsible for what's happening. But as disgusting as they are, they've got every legal right in the world to exist. And expose that venom they've mistaken for politics to anybody who wants to listen. But they'll cross that legal line. They're bound to, judging from their tactics.
Thank you, Supergirl. This is such a better reaction than Captain America gave at first, where he's just I can't do anything, right? On the one hand, I'm frustrated that she's it's kind of funny that Supergirl doesn't seem to care about legality with most supervillains she's fighting, right? Most times she's oh man, they legally have a right to villain. That doesn't come up, but fine, whatever. At least she's voicing her disgust and anger and lack of acceptance of this and saying I'm watching them like a hawk, and the moment they step over the line, I'm going to be seeking justice against them.
Yeah, and Supergirl, Superman, Captain America, these types of heroes are prone to they've got the legal right to say what they want, kind of thing. But I just like that Supergirl wants to smash things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
pre-crisis Supergirl is so, in many ways, so demure and, sweet. She's I want to smash them.
Yeah, she would totally fit in 2022, and with it's making me think of that book, Superman Smashes the Klan, right?
Yeah,
it's with racism and Nazis, you just smash them. You don't have to wait. It's so funny. But Henry, you were making an interesting point about this issue in comparison to last episode. What was that?
Yeah, well, so we looked it up, and this issue came out literally a year after Captain America 275 with kind of similar story beats with superhero coming home and talking to their elderly friend who's a Holocaust survivor, and then getting involved with the villains and sort of defending free speech or whatever. And so
absolutely right. And then, like, just adding on that, in Captain America, remember there was the whole neo-Nazi rally and the counter protest, and we're going to be seeing in this issue that similarly there's like a sort of white supremacist Nazi rally that's going to happen. Like, they're very similar stories.
Right. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, on the one hand, is it a cliche? Is this the only type of Jewish story you can tell is a Holocaust story? And then is the only type of Holocaust story you can tell one where there's an elderly Jewish lady befriending a young Gentile? Or is this a common story for many survivors? And I think actually the latter.
Right. Like, it feels very grounded in the experience of probably survivors living in various cities throughout the U.S. or in whatever country that they move to. And I'd imagine, right, there's suddenly the secret of discovering that you're a neighbor, right? Like, I'd imagine people weren't rushing to the doors to tell everyone I'm a survivor who went through this experience. It wasn't necessarily common knowledge. And right. I'm actually wondering if here in the 1980s, was this a sort of like opening of the floodgates moment where did something happen in the early 1980s that made these stories either suddenly palatable or more welcome in public discourse? Like, I feel like it can't be a coincidence to suddenly have such similar stories in the comic books. And, right. Mouse is just around the corner. It's going to be coming out, I think in 1986, right? So clearly comic books and just media in general actually bringing in the narratives of survivors is becoming more and more common in the 80s, but I'm not an expert enough to know sort of what was that turning point. What was the
do you think like maybe cable news, like the invention of cable news, like 24-hour news cycle might have just being aware of more things in the world all the time or something?
Yeah, it could be that. I also wonder the degree to which it's sort of generational. And so you have survivors of the camps and their children, right? So by the 60s, you've got the youngest survivors are in their 20s and anyone who was 20 in 1945, by the mid 60s, they're in their 40s. So by the time you get to the 80s, you sort of have a generational shift, right? Like, once you get to 40 years roughly, and there's actually, as we know from the Israelites wandering in the desert, 40 is frequently within Jewish history and tradition, a significant number representing an entire passing from one generation to the next. So I wonder if it's just that distance in time from the Holocaust that allowed people to talk about it more. Like, I wonder if it was too raw to discuss publicly any earlier than that.
Yeah, could be.
Well, let's keep going. In a lovely way, we find that on page 13, the other residents in this building, they are all showing great allyship. The other residents are talking about taking on those responsible themselves because they don't trust the police. The police are not going to help them quick enough. Supergirl, in her civilian identity, is trying to caution them, don't give up your lives to this hatred. She's trying to encourage them not to take things into their own hands. And then her neighbor, Cheryl, says this incredible line, "Take a good look at me, Linda. In case you haven't noticed, I'm black, and that means they're after me too. They're just waiting to wrap up one final solution before they start on another is all." So we're seeing this really strong instance in the 1980s of sort of allyship connection, this idea that these struggles are the same, that people of color and Jews are both victims of neo-Nazis, right? Or both the sort of chosen targets.
Right. I mean, this is serious stuff. This is like what we talked about last week. This is like kids were picking up this comic.
Absolutely.
In the grocery store. Like, these are really real adult, mature conversations. In 1983, it's on the pages of Supergirl, like a kid's comic drawn by Carmine and Infantino. You'd think just she's not up to some silliness in these issues,
right? As you said, she's off to college and making it on her own in the city of Chicago and dealing with some really real issues.
By the way, I wanted to say earlier, when you read the narration of there's there being a series of anti-Semitic attacks in Chicago, it's very jarring to read that in a comic, and reflect on that. I'm sorry, I'm from Chicago. I live in Chicago. You used to live in Chicago. That's all. I guess I shouldn't make that as an assumption that everyone knows that.
but it hits home, right? It like sort of hits home to think of it as being like, we've talked about representation. So for you especially, like I lived in Chicago, but you're like grew up there, and like Chicago is home in so many ways. And so the idea of like having Jewish representation, but via the to have Jewish representation, but through the vehicle of anti-Semitic attacks in your city, like it can make things a little scary and a little real, and makes you wonder about, there were certainly Nazi marches in Skokie, as we know, in the area. Like what year was the famous Nazi march in Skokie?
1978.
Right. So the Nazi march in Skokie was in 1978. This is 5 years later, so it's clearly like living memory for Paul, I'm sure.
Right. I mean, it's what I did mention earlier in the let's catch everyone up to where Supergirl is. It says explicitly on the first or second page of this series of issue 1, on the north side of Chicago at Chicago University is whatever made up university she's going to. So it's like that's a Jewish area, especially in 1983. So it could have been West Rogers Park, which be very common to live in an apartment building with a Jewish neighbor. So so just in terms of things that like really hit home for me.
Of course. Despite living next to a Jewish neighbor, though, on page 14, Linda is actually shocked when her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Berkowitz, condones the behavior, because Linda, or Supergirl, is convinced that this is just the actions of a few fringe lunatics. This is not, the mainstream. And Mrs. Berkowitz responds, "Don't you know your history, child? Mein Gott, how do you think it began last time, except with a small band of maniacs?" And she holds up a newspaper showing, what do you know? There's a social reformist rally okayed for Grant Park. And in this case, social reformist is sort of a code for Nazi, for neo-Nazi or white supremacist.
Grant Park, by the way, is the big park in Chicago where if a rally was being held there, that would be a big deal. Like
it would get a lot of attention.
Like it's where like the blues festival and jazz festival is. It's where the Bulls, Chicago Bulls in the 90s had all of their rallies,
And it's right. And it's where in recent years the Women's March took place.
Right. Absolutely.
Like, it is the place. Yeah. I got to admit, Henry, I'm a little frustrated and upset at this point because Supergirl's condoning, like, I spoke too soon. She's as bad as Captain America. I hate it.
She's all right. Let me defend her a little bit. She is young. She's probably about 19 years old here. And, she's been flying around with Streaky. Like she hasn't exactly had the experience that her cousin has had over the years. So maybe she's learning. Captain America fought in World War II. He doesn't have an excuse.
No, fair point. He saw it with his own eyes. Yeah.
I want to cut her a little bit of slack, but I mean, it's disappointing to see your number one hero, for which the comic you're reading is named, doing this thing. So she's young, and like it's possible she hangs around like her cousin and the Fortress of Solitude. Like maybe this is her first Jewish friend, although she was in the Legion of Superheroes, so perhaps she knew Colossal Boy.
Oh, that's really interesting because, okay, is the Holocaust still a big deal in the 31st century? Right? Because or is it just one of many horrible things that happened to the Jews? Because I'm thinking like, for us, we're so close to the Holocaust. It looms so large. It casts such a long shadow, but there were things like the Crusades. There were things like the Spanish Inquisition. There were horrible
pogroms for 100 years.
Pogroms that have happened that were like terrible. And we kind of like we're like, yeah, it's part of Jewish history. So if we're talking about 10 centuries in the future, right? Like 1,000 years in the future, like is the Holocaust, like is that just ancient history to Colossal Boy? Maybe he didn't know to bring it up because it would be as awkward and strange as if I had met someone who wasn't Jewish and I was just like, let me tell you about them Crusades.
Well, let me ask you a question. In the Age of Heroes, so let's say in that world, the Justice Society existed during World War II with Superman, whatever.
Yeah.
Was the Holocaust the last really super bad thing that happened to the Jews until the 31st century? Meaning, was there another thing as bad as that and the Crusades and everything? Because, or is it that in the Age of Heroes, superhero wouldn't let something like that happen again?
We're getting into such difficult, this is the hardest part of superhero where it's like, it's escapism. And then, this is related but unrelated. Some comic book publishers, I think Marvel kind of has this policy, or at least some of its writers hold by it, of there's no magical curing cancer, right? It's like when you have Reed Richards and Tony Stark and Bruce Banner and all these super geniuses in the Marvel universe, you would kind of ask why isn't any of them thinking about how to cure cancer? And there's a certain degree to which it's they obviously should. And yet the editorial mandate is it's too much of an FU to the people who die to cancer to then have it magically solved within these comic books that are meant to sort of show the reality. So I feel because it wouldn't just be Jewry, right? It would be sort of worldwide, right?
It'd be like genocide, basically.
Right. In the world of the superheroes, does that mean that in every comic book that we don't have anything that happens? Right. Are there no more genocides? Are there no more tyrants taking over? But then you start to enter into things that Warren Ellis would write about in The Authority, where the only way that would probably happen is if superheroes start becoming a police state. Right. And now we're making our way it's not surprising we're coming up with this. We are in the 1980s. We're in a mad rush to The Dark Knight Returns and to Alan Moore's Watchmen and to all these comics that sort of bring up these points. But I think once you start really picking at the fabric, the whole thing comes apart once you get into that, because the only way it could work is if superheroes become very fascist very quickly. Right.
Which is the kind of superhero comics I don't like.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, back in the superhero comics you do like, the one we're reading right now, on page 17, we have moved to the rally in Grant Park where a robed woman speaks.
Who then is our enemy? I needn't tell you that. You do not need to hear the words from my lips to know the truth. All of us here recognize our oppressors as they have been recognized since the days of the pharaohs. All of us know we are under their heavy hand, an international conspiracy we need to cast off before.
This is Blackstarr. She's cut off, and she's given real Protocols of the Elders of Zion energy, Henry.
Oh yeah.
She is going about as deep as possible into some of these anti-Semitic tropes.
I just love Kara's. We gotta pick a name. There's Linda Kara, Supergirl. Linda Lee. I love that she's like, my lord, I can't believe that racist filth that woman's spouting. She's pretty outraged. So
right, it is nice. Unlike Captain America, who sits there and is like, they have a right to say it. She's outraged by it. So in Blackstar's speech, right, she mentions that it's been recognized since the day of the pharaohs, and that brings us right at the beginning of the book of Exodus, when Melech Hadash al Mitzrayim, when we have a new king, a new pharaoh over Egypt. In Exodus 1:7, there is this verse that says, Uvenei Yisrael paru v'yishratzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu bim'od me'od v'timaleh ha'aratzotam. But the Israelites increased and swarmed. They multiplied and increased very greatly. So the land is full of them. And if we skip forward a couple verses in Exodus 1:10, Pharaoh says in response to this, this language that says literally they swarmed, like that verb from verse 7 of swarming, that's literal insect or bug or vermin language, right? So even in the Torah, it's sort of indicating the way that Egyptians felt about the Israelites, about the Jewish people. And so Pharaoh says, let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground.
Yeah, it's Pharaoh being the first like racist against physical, like recorded in history, on a page, I guess. If it,
Yeah,
it's just like it's what now we would call typical anti-Semitism, but comparing Jews to vermin, to swarms. They're swarming, and swarmy and infesting places. They're, this is the same stuff that Hitler was saying.
Absolutely right. And then, it contained within the Exodus verse that I was just reading, there's that basis of anti-Semitic conspiracy right there in Pharaoh's words, right? The idea of we're nervous because if we fight other enemies, they may betray us, basically, right? From within. Like this idea of Jews being disloyal, of Jews betraying, that becomes this fear. And that's sort of referenced in the idea of like this secret international conspiracy that like Jews are actually in control and are going to turn against you in this way, right? Like you just... Blackstar's just tapping into some really scary stuff that again is rooted back to the very first instance of sort of a group of people oppressing the Jewish people while claiming the Jewish people are oppressing them. Totally. As we continue on the next page, there is this ruddy bearded man who interrupts Blackstar's talk and accuses her of spreading fascism and oppression, and she sort of responds, "Why would this guy care unless he's one of them?" And then on page 19, the first time I saw it, I loved this page to no end, because you just see this man ripping open his shirt to reveal the hairiest chest and a large Star of David necklace as he says, "Damn straight I am, hate monger. I'm a Jew and so are they." And it feels like such a like rallying point of pride. At which point a group of Jewish protesters show up with weapons and assault and storm the stage. Yeah, he looks like King David with the big Star of David, and he's so red, like King David is described as ruddy. Yes. And mostly it's usually interpreted that meant King David in the Bible had red hair and a red beard, but it could also just mean like rosy cheeked. But either way, this was like a cool panel. This was like, yeah, it's so cool until you turn the page and they arrest him. Yeah, and it turns out he was an actor who was purposely hired to incite violence and stir it up. And then you see a panel. The guy's not actually Jewish. He got hired to do it. He tosses the Star of David to the ground and stomps on it, breaking it and breaking my heart with it. Why did you have to take a panel that I thought I'd celebrate for years and turn it into such heartbreak? It's unbelievable. It's kudos to the team here of Kupperberg and Infantino, because this was such a brilliant introduction to heel turn within just a few panels. It was incredible. One page. Absolutely. It just it turned it around, and it's so, reading it in 2022, it's kind of weird to read about a protest and to see somebody who villainously was hired to stir up violence at a protest, and to think about recent years in U.S. history with accusations flying that there are professional protesters being paid to show up, but it's not actually reflective. And it's really weird, because what happened in the real world, it's full lies. And then here you're seeing those kinds of tactics being used to uphold forces of fascistic evil. There's this weird sort of, whiplash that I'm sort of experiencing as I'm looking at it in the lens of 2022, but it's as you said, certainly effective. Yeah. So we continue our story. That's the end of that issue, and we continue on with Supergirl Volume 2, number 14 in December '83. Same creative team. Yep, same creative team. This issue is called Starlight Starbright. Blackstarr rises tonight, which must have been a rejected oath of the Green Lanterns at some point. So on page 1, the narration identifies Blackstarr as a Nazi, just to catch the readers up. You got all of the first issue to get introduced to it. It's she's a Nazi. That's what we are. And yet on page 6, as Supergirl confronts Blackstarr, Blackstarr makes an accusation against Supergirl, claiming that she's a brainwashed flunky of the conspiracy. Henry, what does Blackstarr say next?
You are a fool for believing they are pitiful, put upon minority, believing their fairy tales of genocide, when we but wish to purify ourselves by exterminating them like the vermin they are.
Her dialogue is just so gross.
I know,
right? It's checklist style. We have globalist conspiracy, check. Holocaust denial, check. References to Jews as vermins or rats, check.
Yeah.
She is winning her anti-Semite bingo card.
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
like all of them are being marked. So yeah, Blackstar's pretty gross. On page 8, interestingly, after all of these comics where we get frustrated because the hero is like, violence isn't the answer, we now see on page 8 Mrs. Berkowitz telling Joni, that that other neighbor, that she's not thrilled to see Supergirl fighting. She says, quote, "Try to understand, it is the violence that upsets me, because it reminds me of the violence I lived through in Auschwitz and other places." And that just kind of hits me, like the idea. It's not a superhero trying to moralize and saying violence isn't the answer. You're just as bad as them if you're violent, which is clearly like an egregious claim as Captain America had made. But like to see a show survivor be like, yeah, the violence is triggering and traumatic for me and brings me back to what I went through, like makes sense to me. And here, I think this is the first time in these issues that we discovered which camp she was in, namely that she survived. Unlike Anna Kappelbaum in Marvel,
was in a fictional one,
who was at a fictional camp. Here, she came out of Auschwitz.
Yeah. Sorry if this is an obvious question, but what do you think she meant by and other places? Just that, like, she probably had to move around a lot and might have been in multiple camps, or
I was wondering if it was that, or I wondered, and maybe I made this up, but I feel like there was some point where the implication seemed to be that maybe she like escaped Warsaw and went to other places and then came back to Auschwitz. So maybe she was in other camps besides that, and that's the implication. But you're right. Maybe it is like, maybe she had a life full of much violence, even beyond the Shoah. I don't know. But I know that Mrs. Berkowitz claims she just wants peace, and then she goes back home to a swastika on her door and to Nazis in Grant Park, telling the world that she's the evil one. And you just like, again, my heart broke in the last issue because of that panel, but like my heart's breaking here also, of like this poor woman who just wants to be left alone and isn't bothering anyone, and is being told that she is representative of like the truest evil in the world. Like that's just some insidious and gross anti-Semitism.
Right.
She and Joni continue talking. On page 9, she claims she couldn't bear to go through another Holocaust, and so she shows a photo of her family. She refers to how she thought she was overreacting back in 1935 in Poland. And the first time I read this, I was like, why 1935? The Nazis don't invade until 1939. This doesn't make, I was very baffled by it. But as it turns out, in 1935, there was a Polish statesman who served as chief of state named Joseph Klemens Pilsudski, who was pretty good for the Jews, but died in 1935. And following his death, things were not quite as great for the Jews due to his death, the Great Depression, and other things going on. And so the Jewish experience in Poland started to go downhill before the Nazis invaded. Mrs. B is sharing the story, and Joni responds to tell her that kind of talk freaks her out. Please sit down and stop bringing it up. And my only response is really like, oh, F you and your fears, Joni. Like, why are you making this about you? Like, I cannot imagine the level of ignorance and privilege it would take to have someone sharing that with you and have you be like, this freaks me out. I don't want to hear about how your family was murdered in a genocide. Like,
yeah, I know.
So as we continue, a weird thing starts to happen on page 11 as Mrs. Berkowitz is convinced Blackstarr looks just like her daughter Rachel. And so the math doesn't check out because her daughter would be significantly older, at least 40, and Blackstarr appears to be a very young woman. And so Joni also mentions that Rachel died when she was 11. But Mrs. B's response is, I never saw a body. It wasn't till after the war that I tracked my Rachel's records. They said she was killed in 41. But the camps often kept wrong records. Maybe someone else died and they mistakenly said it was Rachel. So she weirdly, in this Nazi supervillain, starts to think maybe this is somehow her daughter who she had thought died in Auschwitz in 1941. Mrs. B knows it sounds crazy, and in her sort of defeated voice says, you're right. Why should Blackstarr be anything but scornful of me, a Jew? We pick up again on page 15 at the Congregation Beth Israel on Chicago's North Side, which means it's time for us to play our favorite game, Henry. Can we identify that synagogue?
Yes, there are two in Chicagoland area.
Two Beth Israels, not one, but two Beth Israels.
Yes, there's Temple Beth Israel, which is on Dempster Street in Skokie, Illinois.
Okay.
And there's, of course, Lincolnwood Jewish Congregation, AG Beth Israel.
Oh my gosh, I love it. It's almost like, yeah, even on a desert island, the guy goes and builds two Beth Israels.
Right.
The Beth Israel he prays that, and the Beth Israel he doesn't.
I mean, in Spaceballs, when they need a name of a synagogue, what do they use?
Sure ain't Temple Beth Israel.
Love you, Dottie. Yeah, fair enough. So we have this congregation on the north side of Chicago. Narration mentions that membership is dwindling, the building is in disrepair, but Rabbi Nathan Zuber knows that it's better to feed the needy than to fix up the building. And we see this rabbi, Nathan Zuber, the latest in our collection of comic book rabbis. We should make a list at some point, Henry, of all the different comic rabbis we've encountered in this podcast. But he's sitting at his desk poring over books, and this is the most Hasidic looking rabbi I've ever seen, with like large white flowing hair and beard, black clothes, black kippah. I can't tell if he's a rabbi or a wizard in a certain way.
Yeah, he sort of looks like the wizard Shazam in a way.
Yeah, a little bit like that. It's really interesting because it's like this very Hamish looking environment, and sort of the sense of like, yeah, there's less interest in the building. Like it's really about helping people.
Right.
And page 16, we see these panels going back and forth between Blackstar's forces assembling outside the synagogue to attack it, and Rabbi Zuber walking through the sanctuary, just sort of tending to the place. Yeah. There's wooden folding chairs. There's a Ner Tamid hanging from the ceiling. There's an Amud ahead that is likely for Torah readings. It's even got a Stender on top.
Yeah, it looks like a tiny little shtibel. Like we've seen these in these other comics, we've seen these sort of what sort of look like, either from the outside or the inside, these big, built in the 1950s synagogues, temples, right? And this is the first one we've seen where it's just like looks like a tiny little storefront synagogue that you might see on the north side of Chicago. Yeah. So it's just kind of cool, the modesty of it, you know.
Absolutely. And it's nice to have a synagogue depicted in 1980s comics that also like looks like a humble synagogue as opposed to looking like a church, but just drawn with like a Star of David. Right. You know, sometimes we've seen ones that it's like that. No synagogue looks like that.
And also there's nothing inaccurate in this one. You know, how many times have we looked at a synagogue, we're like, why do they have a 4-pointed menorah in the middle of the, you know, right. weird going on. Yeah, here it just looks like there's an aisle. There's clearly seats on either side facing a large table with a cover on it and kind of a Stender on top of it. And he's walking under the eternal light, the Ner Tamid. That's it. That's a synagogue to me. I mean, the chapel, shul, you know.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate. And Rabbi Zuber hears a door open, asks whoever it is if they can help. And instead of getting a request for help, someone tosses in a Molotov cocktail. On page 17, Mrs. Berkowitz, whose first name is Ida, by the way, we haven't mentioned that until now, she feels some dread that something is happening, and her gut instinct, she's feeling it in her kishkas, Henry, and she is right because of the cocktail. But Bezrat Hashem, thankfully, Supergirl is flying over the burning building and notices it in flames and goes, a synagogue. So on page 18, Supergirl flies in, encourages Rabbi Zuber to run away, but he's not running away. He's trying to go into the flames and responds, "Save yourself. I must reach the Torah." And then Supergirl flies him into the building and grabs the Torah.
That is a great super feat. That might be like top 5 super feat of all time, is saving a Torah and the rabbi at the same time. Like Superman, that's a classic Superman move, like as made famous by Superman the movie, catching the double jeopardy, the rescuing Lois and then catching the helicopter, because the Superman, Supergirl, they always save the day. There's no either or for them. They just do both. And in this case, both was a Torah.
I love it. I think I made this joke when we were talking about it, but it's like, it makes me think of Green Goblin at the end of the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, where he's holding Mary Jane and the bus full of children, and he goes, "Now choose," right? So I'm just imagining instead it's like Green Goblin holding a rabbi and a Torah, and it's like, "All right, Supergirl, you must choose." She doesn't have to make a choice.
No,
she saves them both.
Because that's what supers do.
That's what they do. And we're so delighted, and Rabbi Zuber is also delighted. He can't believe it. Yes, praise God, you have done a mitzvah, a great deed. And I love the fact that we get the most liberal translation of the word mitzvah from the most orthodox looking rabbi. Mitzvah, of course, is a commandment, certainly considered a more general term for good deeds. We have this here. I love the feat too much to be too upset about, like to pick too much at the translation. The rabbi's glad the Holy Torah is safe, and he passes out. So, just again, great work, Supergirl. Such a cool moment.
This is like a dream come true moment for me, seeing Supergirl save a rabbi and a Torah in one moment, one fell swoop. This is great.
Absolutely. And on page 19, I guess Rabbi Zuber wakes up again because he tells Supergirl, "Don't worry so much about him. Worry more about stopping those responsible." And Supergirl lets him know, "Hold on, Rabbi, help is here." And for me, I just think it's cool when superheroes talk to rabbis.
Yes.
It's just so fun that a superhero is like, "Hold on, Rabbi, we'll get you help." It's just really neat.
It's incredible.
Yes, it's incredible. What's less incredible is when Supergirl confronts Blackstarr, accusing her of sending men to firebomb the synagogue. Blackstarr does not deny it. She takes full credit and in fact says,
"Of course, what else do their kind deserve?"
And as they continue fighting on page 20, the debate keeps going.
"Poor naive girl, you truly think them innocents? Ah, well, the world might never have come to this point had they not been able to dupe so many with their lies. You are but one of their dupes, Supergirl, and while I pity you for that, that shall not stand in the way of eliminating you."
Right. So, gosh, it's so wild. I know that fake news is sort of a modern concept, but really the sort of horrendous lies that Blackstarr is spreading, this deep belief that no, you've been manipulated by the Jews into thinking they're innocent when they secretly run everything and they're the reason the world is suffering. It's just, again, it's some of the most gross and dangerous anti-Semitism because there are genuinely people who believe this.
Right.
And on page 23, towards the end of the issue, once again, Mrs. Berkowitz confronts Blackstarr, acknowledging, "You're my daughter, Rachel."
Yeah.
And Rachel recognizes Mrs. Berkowitz as her mother.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to be like, wait, what the hell kind of strange turn did this story just take?
Oh, it's a great cliffhanger that makes you want to read the next issue. The layout is one big splash page on one page with 2 boxes on top. And Mrs. Berkowitz says, "Oh my God, Rachel, my Rachel." And then you get a zoom in twice on Blackstarr. And she just says, "Mama."
Oh,
it's incredible. And then next issue, by the way, next issue, Starfall, on sale October 17th. It's a date. So pretty close to when we're recording this. It's kind of cool.
We're so close to the anniversary of these issues. It reminds me of the Moon Knight story we covered about Moon Knight's childhood rabbi that turned out to be a Nazi pretending to be a rabbi. And now we have this weird mirror version of a young Jewish girl who, as we're about to discover, survives the Holocaust and then grows up to be a Nazi.
Right.
Like, it's just sort of, it's a little, it's like if a superhero having an elderly Jewish neighbor who is actually a Holocaust survivor and gets very upset about modern waves of anti-Semitism is like the cliche repeat story that we've now seen a couple times. The revelation that the supervillain is actually secretly the Jewish character's child, like that's like the opposite of cliche, right? Like we've gone into like bonkers only in comics kind of storytelling.
But when you were reading it for the first time, and earlier she was like, Ms. Berkowitz was like, what if she's my daughter? Did you just dismiss it as well? Or were you like, oh, that's what's going to happen now?
Yeah, no, of course I was like, that's what's going to happen now. But I was also like, this is so weird.
Right.
You know, you end up thinking like maybe she's brainwashed, right? Like, you know, we haven't gotten into what's actually happening yet.
Right.
But my initial thoughts from years of reading comics might be some other, like in Marvel, I think there's a character named like Hate Master who can manipulate people into feeling their rage and hate. So maybe she was like taken over by some other Nazi villain.
Right.
But let's go ahead and conclude our Supergirl story with Supergirl Volume 2, number 15, which had a cover date of January 1984, even though, as you just discovered, it was actually on sale in October of 1983. Love that gap that exists.
It's always so confusing.
So this issue, Starfall, has the same creative team with the one exception that now lettered by Andy Kubert.
Oh, a young Andy Kubert, future DC and Marvel penciler.
Yeah, really an artistic superstar, I would say.
Yeah.
So on page 2, we're picking up where we were. Blackstarr comments that her mother died in Auschwitz 4 decades ago. On page 8, Mrs. Berkowitz is separated from Blackstarr again and gets back to her apartment. And Linda, who once again is the civilian identity of Supergirl, actually in a very sweet move, approaches Mrs. Berkowitz and asks to understand more about the Holocaust, admitting that just seeing things in movies is not enough. And like, that's amazing.
You know, the House of L, they're a family of learners.
Right? Like, I loved seeing that she's willing to admit like, oh, I was wrong when I said like, you shouldn't be condoning this. And she's like, turns out I don't know enough about this.
Right.
Which I guess, once again, to Supergirl's credit, she like Kal-El, like Superman, like she's an alien. Right. So maybe there's a beautiful way in which this whole idea of like racial hatred or anti-Semitism is just a foreign and bizarre concept to them. Right.
Superman and Supergirl also get to be white. So
fair enough. They have some privilege, but they're willing to unpack it potentially.
Right.
So Mrs. Berkowitz comments that basically the experience was men are just making decisions about their lives. A man you don't even know. And he's pointing, saying, you shall live, you shall die. Not a soulless monster, a man. I can't help but read that, you shall live, you shall die. I know that it's clearly a reference to lines at the camps where they would indicate one direction for going to the work camp and another direction for being killed. But it felt very Unatana Tokef to me, the liturgical poem that we read at High Holiday time, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which has a line, right, of saying like God's the only one who knows mi yichyeh u'mi yamut, who shall live and who shall die. And I wonder if Paul was being clever with his writing and sort of purposely saying, in this case, it's not God making the decision, but it's in the hands of an evil man.
Maybe Mr. Kupperberg was a Leonard Cohen fan. He was channeling Who by Fire, which of course is based on Unatana Tokef. So absolutely. On page 9, as Mrs. Berkowitz continues telling her story, and also just like how strong and great that they've like built up in this way to reveal the story. Like we have the modern anti-Semitism and the hints at it, and like by the time at this part 3, when you get the story of her experience in the Holocaust, it lands with more weight than I think it would have if you just started with that. Yeah, this was really good, slow burn, right? I mean, this was a series. It seems like you really had to follow. You couldn't pick up an isolated issue. This was a very well written series.
Yeah, well plotted. Mrs. Berkowitz talks about her husband Jaime, who had a tailor shop. The family was happy. And then it was September, and the Germans overran our borders. We stayed with our home, business, friends. We knew it was a bad time, but who thought it could get as bad as it did? And that within months we would be fleeing like criminals across occupied Europe. We ran for months, stealing to eat and finding places to hide. But the Germans always seemed to be ahead of us, blocking our escape. This sounds like a genuine, real record of like something that would happen to a survivor, right? And like you can feel the weight. And I think this is what I was referencing earlier, Henry, where I said, when you asked, what did she mean by saying, Auschwitz and other places? Maybe these are the other places, the like running around Europe while trying to escape. On page 10, they have encountered the Nazis, and Jaime, like a good father and husband, tries to protect his family. The Nazis kill him. Ida and Rachel are thrown into cattle cars, crowded in boxcars, and Ida notes that it's a way that they wouldn't have even treated cattle, which is also reminiscent to some lines that we got in the Captain America issues.
Yes.
And then the two are separated. They're sent to different areas. And Ida talks about the fact that after the Russians liberated the camp, she tried to find her daughter, but the records listed her as dead. And so she was shocked to discover not only did her daughter survive, but she joined the Nazis who tried to kill her and our world, she says, meaning like the Jewish world, right. Which is also, right, this sort of implication of like Judaism itself, the Jewish culture was very nearly wiped out. That's part of what genocide is.
Do you think she also is talking about like even bigger, like Hitler's plan to control the world?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it could be. Yeah. We're skipping forward to page 16. At this point now, Blackstarr has kidnapped her mother, and she's now giving her version of what happened. And so we see in Blackstar's flashback, we see a young girl who's being grabbed by a man, and his arm has the swastika insignia over it. And as Blackstarr narrates it, the man grabs her from her mother's arms. And from Blackstar's perspective, she's like, you just stood there and let him take me. And she's taken to these other children. And it just so happens that Rachel was well educated. So she spoke German, not just Polish, and understood what the Nazis were saying. She understood their fate. And on the next page, Rachel insists that it's a mistake, that she didn't belong, that she's not actually Jewish. And it actually, it brought to mind stories you hear of Jews going to live with non-Jewish families and pretending not to be Jewish to try to survive. Now, granted, in these stories, it's usually before they get captured. A lot of chutzpah from Rachel claiming this while she's already in the camp and has already been captured. And in the story, at least, somehow she amuses the camp commandant, and he ends up adopting her, even though he knows she's Jewish. And she lives in the shelter and gets a better life. She's basically the child version of a capo. And when the Russians liberate the camp, Blackstarr gets a twisted message from it. She decides the Germans were right and that it was cowardice that prevented her mother from saving her, and that same cowardice is what let Jews walk obediently to their deaths in the camps, which, ouch, it's a common trope that gets brought up, that like the Jews were weak and allowed themselves to be led to slaughter. And I think we've probably talked about this image of the weak Jews before in like our Sabra episode, and some others, but it's really awful and gross.
Let me ask you a question about this: the commandant taking her in. Generally, any Gentile that took in a Jew during the Holocaust and saved them from death was like a good thing. In this case, did this guy basically kidnap her? Like, is anything about what he did good in that he saved this Jewish child's life? Like, or was it just like kidnapping? I know that's a tough question.
I mean,
but like, how are we supposed to interpret what he did there?
I don't think we're supposed to read it as like an act of generosity, right? It's sort of an act of, it's showing the capriciousness of the guards, right? It's kind of going back to this idea, there's a man saying you live and you die. She somehow managed to amuse him. And so he's like, well, you're going to live. I'm going to keep you in this way. And like, in a way that's sort of even worse, because you have this group of people that hates the Jews just for being Jews. But then it's like he happens to like one, and so he ends up saving her. But there's a weird way, and I don't think they imply it in this way, but is this so different than instances, as we covered last episode of Jewish women that were forced into sexual acts with Nazis, right? It's like they would choose Jewish women and use them. In this way, does he really view her as human, or is she just like a pet that he sort of keeps because she entertains him? But then she turns out to be a pretty awful schmuck of a person also, because she is clearly self-centered and cruel and, surviving and blaming the others. And there is a weird irony that there are some records and reports that like the people who survived in the camp were not the generous free spirits. Like a lot of the people that survived the camps it was a survival situation. They had to look out for themselves. And so in a way, Rachel reflects that. So it's really complicated and has a lot of layers to it. So I think certainly a bad person happens to take her in, and I don't know if she would have always been so selfish, or if it was sort of being brought up in and living around him that she was corrupted by and brainwashed by his beliefs. I don't know.
All right. Well, either way, it's icky.
Either way, it's icky, and it's unfortunately like the end of our Jewish content in here, which is just at the end of the war, the commandant who dies had prepared false papers to be able to escape. Rachel takes them and she uses them to escape and assume an American identity and gain magical powers and become a villain who never ages and fight Supergirl. And it descends into typical superheroics, but that's the end of the Jewishness. I don't know.
Supergirl does stop by Mrs. B's window and smiles at her, and they have a moment. There's nothing Jewish about it.
Yeah, we have a nice happy ending. And thankfully, we're going to move from that happier ending after some really difficult material into much more lighthearted affair. As Henry, your moment has finally come. We are not talking about Supergirl's supporting cast anymore. We are getting right into the man himself, the Superman. What supporting character are we looking at next?
Okay, so we're looking at Joseph Schumann. You might be wondering, who is Joseph Schumann? That's not a Superman character I'm familiar with. You would be correct. He is not a very common side character, but his first appearance is in Action Comics 831, page 9, page 13. He appears with the kippah on his head. And so it's very clear that he's Jewish, and this, of course, is not to be confused with Brandon
David Schulman from the Kitty Pryde episode. I just love that, like, the last names are so close. Yeah. So we've got this guy Joseph Schumann who just works at the Daily Planet along with Lois and Clark and Perry and Jimmy and all the others.
Yeah. So the first issue we're looking at is Action Comics Volume 1, number 833. November 2005. The name of the story is called Depths. And I just want to give a little context, if I may, for a minute. This is during a strange period of Superman. The core creative team that had brought you Death of Superman, all that stuff, was all broken up now. And they brought back John Byrne, who had, of course, launched Superman, the modern Superman with Man of Steel. They brought him back to pencil, and they brought in Gail Simone to write a bunch of like sort of random Action Comics. I don't know if they were trying something out or just like some guest appearances, but anyway, Depths is written by Gail Simone, penciled by John Byrne, inked by Nelson Norm Rapman, Larry Stucker, colored by Guy Major, lettered by Rob Lay, and edited by Eddie Berganza.
About whom the less said, the better.
Exactly. Yes. Superman, Joseph, and Jimmy are at the Metropolis General Hospital, and Joseph has a favor to ask Superman. And Superman says, of course, if I can, Joseph. And Joseph very cutely says, see what it is, what the thing is. I'd like to invite you to my house for dinner. Shabbos dinner at my house.
Hey! I love it. I love the fact that not only is Joseph wearing his kippah clearly an explicitly Jewish character, but he would have the Ashkenazi pronunciation. It's not Shabbat dinner at Joseph's house; it's Shabbos dinner.
And of course, Superman responds, "Well, Mr. Schumann, I don't usually." Joseph, it's just dinner, Superman, please. It's important. Besides, my wife's the best cook in the state. And Superman says, with that $1 million smile, I'm sure she is. All right, Joseph, I'll try my best. Because, of course, Superman will try his best. That's what Superman does. He tries his best.
Yeah. God, can you just imagine the week that on your like Shabbos guest list, it's like, oh, I'm having Superman over for Shabbos dinner this week. It's just like, do you think that Joseph had an entire community that he would see regularly and they have it over and he's got friends like, oh, if I haven't been with you, come by us for Shabbos this Friday. I can't do
Superman.
it. I'm having Superman over this week. Can I come? No, there's no room for you at the table. It's a very private affair.
This is the kind of thing I love about superheroes and about Superman explicitly, is just that this is the most powerful and most famous person on the planet that could vaporize the whole planet. But he's invited to this nice man's house for Shabbos dinner, and he's going to try his best to go there.
Absolutely. And we don't find out in that issue if Superman does go. In fact, we have to wait 2 more issues to see that, which, like, I guess you could assume the invite went out on maybe like a Monday, and then we have like 2 comics worth of stories. And finally, in Action Comics 835, from January 2006, we get it. We have fairly similar creative team. This is A Contagion of Madness, written by Gail Simone, penciled once again by John Byrne, inked by Nelson DeCastro, but he's just listed as Nelson for some reason, colored by Guy Major, lettered by Phil Balsman, and edited by Eddie Berganza. So tell us, Henry, about the actual Shabbos dinner.
Page 21, Superman and Lois are kind of flying home, and they're having their little banter, and then you see a panel that says 2 nights later, and Superman is landing, and you see his hand ringing the bell of a mezuzah door. It looks like the mezuzahs in as good a place as it could be, and he comes in, and they welcome him in. Joseph introduces Superman to Esther, Esther being Joseph's wife. And Superman, of course, apologizes for being late because he's so polite. And she says, nonsense, we're holding Shabbos dinner for you, and the guest of honor is never late.
Which, I mean, like, on the one hand, so sweet and very wonderful. On the other hand, I don't know how the Shabbos bride is going to feel about knowing Superman's the guest of honor and not her.
I think for Superman, the Shabbos bride will understand. So then, of course, Brandon, the greatest exchange ever happens. Why don't you be Joseph Schumann? I'll be Superman.
Happily.
And you could be Esther also.
Sure. So as they sit down to begin their dinner together, we get from Joseph, normally we make the blessing with wine, but for you tonight only, we got grape juice.
That's very thoughtful, Joseph. I'm familiar with Kiddush.
What?
So there's so many questions right now. Okay. First of all, Superman, did he pronounce it as Kiddush or Kiddush?
Has to be Kiddush.
And second of all, if he's familiar with it, does that mean he has been to at least one other Shabbat dinner, or even maybe perhaps a semi-standing Shabbat dinner, because he's familiar with Kiddush? What does that mean? Does he know it?
Right. Right. So, like, one option is, and we talked about this earlier in this episode, right? Superman also spent a lot of time in the 31st century with the Legion of Superheroes.
Right.
Did Colossal Boy ever have him over for Shabbos dinner? Maybe Colossal Boy had the entire team over for Shabbos dinner in the far future, and Superman learned Kiddush there because he knew about it.
Well, not to get specific here, but this version of Superman was never Superboy and never went to future to be in the suit.
Henry, this is why you're on the podcast. This is the reason for this kind of expertise in DC lore. I expected no less of you. So in that case, either way, either Superman has been to a Shabbat dinner before, or I kind of love more the idea of, like, Joseph invited him to Shabbat, and Superman, being a reporter, right, in his identity of Clark Kent, was like, I need to be prepared and know what this is, and, like, looked up to it and, like, maybe did a little bit of research and preparation. And so I was like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with Kiddush. I understand.
Yeah, it's wonderful that he did the prep. The other great thing about this is that Joseph says, normally we make the blessing over wine, but tonight we got it's tonight for you grape juice. So usually like that's for kids, but that means that Joseph knows this very famous thing about Superman that he doesn't drink. He says again in Superman the movie,
I never drink when I fly.
and that's just a thing about Superman. So is that a thing that everyone knows about Superman, or is Joseph such a Superman super fan that he knows Superman doesn't drink, and so he wouldn't even dare open a bottle of wine? For not that Superman would care, he would want them to have
right. But like we have super considerate host and super considerate guest. In other words, we have Mensch and Superman.
Right.
Like they're kind of just like very sweetly being together. It's very cute. And we haven't talked about it yet, but not only that, but on this panel, what's Superman wearing?
This is like the greatest moment of my life, Brandon, because we have one of several pictures, canonical pictures drawn by the arguably greatest Superman artist of all time, top 5 for sure, of Superman wearing a kippah, holding a glass of wine over a loaf of challah and 2 candlesticks. Now, technically, the loaf of challah should still be covered, but it is a very accurate portrayal of a Shabbat dinner, and Superman is wearing a yarmulke. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to make a poster of it. I'm not kidding. Like the panel on the next page we'll get to.
It's the kind of image that you could probably show someone who didn't listen to our podcast and just be like, yeah, did you know Superman's Jewish? Here's the issue that proves it. Right? It's pretty incredible to see Superman joining, and especially like, as far as I know, Gail Simone is not Jewish.
Not Jewish.
Like she's just like doing an incredible job. Like I'm baffled as to what prompted her to bring this character in.
I know. But
I love it.
She is, wonderful for inclusion. She's an amazing writer who's done a lot of inclusive things in her writing. So, and John Byrne certainly is no stranger to drawing Jewish things in Super. Remember
the reason Kitty Pryde is Jewish is because of his art.
Right. Remember, Claremont says that it was Byrne. That's how Byrne drew her with Magen David, and that's so. So kudos to that at least that main team.
Absolutely.
There. On the next page, Joseph and Esther are just fawning over Superman. Make sure he has enough food, eat. She says, you need lots of these kugels. They're delicious. Is that enough? A little bit more? I mean, it's just taken right out of...
How much time do you think there was? Like, is this like, you need lots of these kugels? They're delicious.
I mean,
a few more moments of silence. Or is she doing it as quickly as you read it the first time?
I think she's doing it as quickly. I think partially 2 things. I think, again, also with Superman, everyone knows he has limited time. And so this is a truncated meal. I don't think he was there for hours singing Zemirot and benching and stuff. I think
this is the 10-minute Haggadah style.
And rightly so, and so thoughtful of him to come, right? Like, let's just say for a second, Superman could be with his wife right now. I mean, he couldn't bring her because then it would have to be him and Clark Kent. And by the way, I bet Joseph Schumann has had the Kent Lanes over for Shabbat dinner, and Clark had to pretend that it wasn't. Like,
that's crazy, Henry.
Right?
What if that's why Superman's familiar with kids? Because Clark Kent was previously a guest in his home.
I figured it out. So anyway, all I'm saying is that like he took his time out of his busy time. Superman, who has no free time whatsoever, is spending his free time at the Schumann. He agreed and he came. Like,
great, fair enough.
And wore a kippah and it familiarized himself with Kiddush. And this looks like a Hamish table. It's like it's got all the Shabbos things on it.
Right.
We've got candles, some discarded plates with some food on them. It looks like they ate pretty much all the things but the green things, and the challah board is in plain view. It's just it's a nice Shabbos table. It looks like a very inviting Shabbos table.
It does. So at the end of the meal, Esther makes the final offer of some dessert, right?
So Esther says, more Superman? Surely some dessert? And Superman's like, And by the way, Superman doesn't need to eat. He just, and Joseph says, quit fussing, Esther. The man wants to know why he was invited here. Am I right? I want to show you something. And then at the bottom of this page, we see this perfect Superman, let's call it the Superman jawline shot of Superman wearing the kippah. That's the one I said I would love to blow up. If I ever meet John Byrne at a con, if he ever happens to do one that I'm at, I am going to blow, I swear to God right now, I'm telling you on this podcast, I will blow up a picture of this panel of Superman smiling wearing kippah and have John Byrne sign that.
I mean, I think that'd be a pretty amazing thing to have signed. Maybe we can get you the original art page somehow.
Maybe. Anyway, so
it tells us the very end of the issue.
Yeah. So at the end of the issue, they finish talking. Joseph and Superman are wearing their kippahs the whole time, and Superman flies off, and Joseph and Esther wave goodbye. And Esther says, "Such a nice young man. No appetite to speak of, however." And it's just adorable.
I love it. I love the idea that it's like, it's kind of playing into the stereotype of a Jewish parent where it's like, even Superman himself is not above some level of like gentle, loving criticism from the parents.
He doesn't eat enough. This boy, he flies around the world. He doesn't eat anything. This is sort of, in many ways, this is the exact opposite of the Supergirl stories we read, but the same level of wonderfulness in terms of, in many ways, there's sort of cliche Jewish tropes in here, but they're not ones we've seen in comics before, and they're not about the Holocaust, which is sort of sometimes the go-to Jewish thing in a comic.
Yeah.
And so this is the opposite, and this feels so Jewish. A Shabbos dinner. What can get more Jewish than that?
Right. I think this is our third Shabbos dinner that we've seen, after one in the far future with Colossal Boy.
Right.
And of course, the alternate universe Shabbos dinner that Batgirl goes to,
right,
where she meets young Miriam. So somehow DC is always doing the Shabbos dinners. I don't think we've seen one at Marvel yet. But yeah, as you've said, just the bringing in of Superman into a Shabbos dinner, it's a beautiful, wonderful thing. I'm felling over that experience. I love the fact that it happened. And shockingly and surprisingly, it is not the only time that we see Shabbos dinner come up in Superman comics. We have one more sort of brief moment to talk about, literally just one panel from a comic.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's from just a couple years ago. Superman Leviathan Rising Special #1. The name of the story is Superman Leviathan Rising, written by Brian Michael Bendis, Greg Rucka, Matt Fraction, Mark Andreyko, penciled and inked by Yannick Paquette. So,
at least there are other artists, but the specific panel we're looking at is penciled and inked by Yannick Paquette.
Right. So I'm not going to explain anything about the story. It doesn't matter. We're getting a glimpse into the hubbub, the bustle of the Daily Planet newsroom, and you see Clark is futzing with his tie. He spilled his boba tea on, and you see in the background, but sort of what we're focused on, Perry yelling at Jimmy and saying, "I need Lois Lane. Lois Lane would have broken this story and we'd be home for Shabbat dinner." That's it.
But why is arguably never in a million years would I think of Perry White as Jewish.
No.
Why is his frame of reference will be home for Shabbat dinner? And there's the possibilities. Perry White is secretly Jewish. Seems unlikely, especially given some I think there was holiday specials and such where he's explicitly celebrating Christmas and pretty clearly not Jewish. Possibility number 2. Harry knows what Shabbat dinner is because Joseph Schumann works at the Daily Planet, and he also has been invited of a Shabbat dinner to get there. Possibility number 3, Metropolis being a metropolitan city that presumably has a large Jewish population. Similar to New York, there are just certain aspects of Jewish culture that are well known, and so it's assumed that within the newsroom, people are familiar with it as a concept.
Right, like on a Friday when Perry's holding the paper on a Friday, and they're like, Perry, we got to get home for Shabbat dinner. Like we got to put the paper to bed.
Right.
Like maybe one of his editors or something is
absolutely
is Jewish.
Part of what's amazing is like, I'm so curious who wrote this part, because you have Brian Michael Bendis.
We have our guys
who's arguably one of the most Jewish writers that we've had.
Yeah.
Right. So I could see Bendis writing it. You have Greg Rucka, who has written some of those beautiful Jewish content, like that Kitty Pryde Yahrzeit issue, among others, right? Like Greg Rucka is the man when it comes to like intelligent Jewish writing,
right? Like
incredible stuff. But then, even though I don't think he's Jewish, you also have Matt Fraction,
right,
who we haven't covered it yet. But Matt Fraction had a fairly recent independent comic called Adventure Man that features prominently in the first issue a strange family that is gathering together again for Shabbos dinner. Like that's another instance of Shabbos dinner. So like any of the three could believably have been the one to write this.
I think that, well, here's the thing that's
maybe Mark Andreyko, but I doubt it.
Yeah, maybe. So first of all, it feels to me like Bendis. I don't know why, it just feels like it. And he was writing all the like Superman and Leviathan stuff at the time. There's no way Perry White is Jewish. I mean, it would be incredible, but I've just seen so much evidence that he's not. Church and Christmas and basically that stuff, that I don't think he's Jewish. But he does say we'd be home for Shabbat dinner. Whose home is he referring to? His own home? Jimmy's home? Someone else's home? Then if it's someone else's home, why would he say we'd be home for Shabbat dinner?
I mean, I think it's just like, in this case, an expression, right?
Okay.
It's like, like I don't think it would be that different from like, I don't even know what it would be. Like, it wouldn't be a surprise. Like Lois Lane would have had this broken story and we'd be home in time for Christmas Eve. We'd be home in time for like church service.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think he literally means that they have a Shabbat dinner to get to that night. I think it's just like an expression of speed. And that's why, like, the question becomes, why would non-Jewish Perry use this expression? Right. And then that only feels, that's what I think. I don't think there's a literal Shabbat dinner to get to. I think it's just like a cute turn of phrase, which again feels very Bendis to me.
Interesting. Okay. So then, is that implying that today is Friday in this panel, that like they're trying to put the weekend paper before the weekend comes to bed? Like maybe
I would say if indeed Perry White's not Jewish, all the more so I feel like it implies that it's not Friday, right? Like I can imagine, like I think it's just again an expression. Like, can you imagine on a Tuesday, Lois Lane would have had this done and we'd be home in time for Shabbos dinner or for Shabbat dinner? But I don't know. Maybe it's a Friday. Maybe that's the expression he makes.
I have so many questions. I mean, I really need to. If I had one question to ask Brian Michael Bendis, it would be about this. What does this mean? What does this panel mean?
Well, I know that it means that we have a tiny bit more Jewish content in the Superman comic. And that brings us to the end of the issues that we're sort of formally covering.
We're looking at Superman Volume 2, number 54 from April of 1991. This is part 3 of the Time and Time Again story. The subtitle is The Warsaw Ghetto, written by Jerry Ordway, penciled by Jerry Ordway, inked by Dennis Yankee, colored by Glenn Whitmore, lettered by John Costanza, edited by Mike Carlin and Dan Thorsland. This is from like, I just want to say, Brandon, this is from like the heyday of me reading comics. I remember reading this live and being blown away by it and everything. But Superman is basically is lost traveling through time, and he keeps bouncing to different areas of time. He's in like prehistoric times, he's in whatever. So he bounces to the Warsaw Ghetto. And I think the reason why we wanted to mention this is because, much like a Captain America issue, he, on page 6, he said Superman is thinking to himself as he's been transported there, and says, from what I've seen so far, this is all that's left of the Polish city of Warsaw and their ruins. What I remember of history, the Germans divided Warsaw into two sectors, one for Aryans, one for Jews. The Nazis called this the resettlement community, but it was a little more than a way station for Jews destined for death camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Belsen. Hitler's final solution,
Thank you, Encyclopedia Superman.
Right. This is the way his brain works, right? Like he's read every book ever in 5 seconds. Yeah. He encounters some Jews, and he thinks more to himself. Warsaw's Jewish district was supposed to be shut down by mid-May 1943. But here it's early June, and there's still survivors being policed by the Nazi SS. And and then later he's called an Ubermensch, and he's trying to remember his German, which he doesn't much of. It's like,
and basically, the reason he gets into these hyper specifics is that he starts to think that his traveling through time is already impacting
the future,
history potentially.
Right.
It could be changing things in this way, right. and he is so moved by the experience and so moved by sort of seeing the Jews suffering that he decides, even at the risk of changing the future and even at the risk of him never being able to go home again, he needs to do something to help.
Right.
He needs to get involved.
He needs to do something. Yeah.
We're not going to go too much deeper. Usually we give you every panel. We didn't want to do too much because we've been doing so much that is sort of Holocaust based. And also we're bringing it up more to get into an overall conversation than to dive into the specifics, because this one really focuses much more on the Nazis than it does on the Jews directly.
Right. And so I think what I wanted to say about that is that where we covered Captain America in depth, there he is actually liberating a Jewish camp. Superman, in these 2 pages that we talked about, page 6 and 7, he refers to the Jews by name, which is something we don't always see. And in comparison to the Captain America issues, with Captain America, we were talking about how it sort of it retcons and fixes a part of history that really is, if this is a hero that's famous for punching Nazis, he must have liberated a camp or 2 in his time, right? We spent a long time talking about that last issue. The question is the same for Superman. Historically, Superman and Captain America were punching Nazis on the pages of their comics at the exact same time. But
these are 2 golden age heroes, literally famous for punching Hitler on the covers and within the pages of the comic.
But there's never anything about Jews, right? Now, so Captain America, I think in part in the 80s, they're fixing a story. Superman, that history was restarted in 1986. So Superman was never in World War II. Now, the Justice Society were, and there's a whole other question there. They must have liberated the camp or 2, but maybe not. And so this never was a part of Superman's history. So the way to do it here, I think what Jerry Ordway is doing, and the super team at large, headed by Mike Carlin, is trying to do the same thing that Captain America is doing, which is correct this part of history without screwing up the timeline and making sure it's still a part of Superman's history. That's just my read on it. So they write a little thing. Well, he's in a time travel thing, so let's have him go back there.
Right. And I think the sort of conversation that we're edging towards and that we are on the brink of having is essentially why is it that we have 2 such similar tales, right? The one in Supergirl and the one in Captain America. Why is it that we have a flashback issue in Captain America in which he liberates Diebenwald, and a time travel story in Superman in which he potentially helps to liberate the Warsaw Ghetto? Why do we have these sorts of things? And of course, it's that these are Captain America and Superman are arguably about as equivalent as it gets in Marvel and DC. Captain America doesn't have the kind of strength that Superman does, but I remember, in Marvel versus DC, when the 2 companies had their crossover and fought each other, right? Superman and Captain America were the comparison points, right? It was sort of, you could maybe have Iron Man and Batman as the billionaires who fight crime, and then Thor and Wonder Woman patterned up. But when it comes to the big 3 of Marvel and the big 3 of DC, Captain America and Superman are both paragons of the American way, truth, justice, and the American way. And so, as you said, we see these stories that are essentially trying to redeem both of them as later artists and writers struggle and grapple with the question of like, well, if the character was around, shouldn't they have done something? Shouldn't they be involved? Why did they let this happen? And so, as you said, we see these comics that draw it or that address it directly.
Well, I just want to say another thing. I just want to point out, and I don't think we may have mentioned in the last episode, but it was very brave and revolutionary for what Simon and Kirby were doing and what Siegel and Schuster were doing later writers at DC, because already by 45 Superman Siegel hadn't been drawing anymore. But anyway, that was very brave, and like, I don't want to make it seem like I'm not appreciative of that, and that's a huge part of history.
Sure.
So much so that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were the Nazis were aware of them. Hitler was aware of them, and they were actually in a little bit of danger because I just want to read an excerpt from my friend Roy Schwartz's "Is Superman Circumcised?" which we talked about before. It says, yes, Captain America famously punches Hitler in the face on the cover of his first comic, but the truth is that before that, on February 27th, 1940, Siegel and Schuster published a 2-page imaginary story in the pages of Look magazine to tell how Superman would end the war. He storms through the Siegfried Line, that supposedly impenetrable fortification line between Germany and France. He twists Nazi candidates into pretzels. He punted the Luftwaffe out of the sky. He grabs Hitler and Stalin by the scuff of their necks. And this story predates Captain America. Superman was the first to do that. So like that stuff is I think amazing for what was being done at the time. And it's sort of like Claremont, DeMatteis, Jerry Ordway are doing here. It's sort of like Talmud, like they're sort of adding on to it's Midrash, sort of adding on to the lore of the story by, of course, what this really is about with Superman and Captain America fighting the Nazis is that they're also, of course, they also saved Jews, right?
Right. There's an interesting sort of way in which, at the time that Siegel and Schuster were making Superman comics, in a lot of ways, Superman becomes wish fulfillment. Desire. This is the Midrashic desire in a certain way for things to go differently.
Right.
And I guess there ends up being a question of, well, what happens? What is the challenge? They were writing in the midst of it happening.
Right.
So when you have the privilege of being decades and decades into the future, when Ordway is writing and when Claremont was writing, and when all these issues we've been covering lately came out, how do you allow for that same level of escapism and wish fulfillment without sort of dishonoring things by changing history entirely?
Right. Belittling
Like, how do you both
it,
allow these super characters to interact with Nazis? And of course they would then interrupt, but also again, like otherwise we'd be living in a complete alternate timeline of Captain America or Superman literally stopped the war and liberated all the camps in the way that you would expect them to if they really existed at that time. So it's just sort of interesting, like that comic you're describing from the 1940s could in a way only come from the 1940s, I suppose, until you get someone like Quentin Tarantino, who then makes a movie like Inglourious Basterds, which does decide to do a complete wish fulfillment where it's like, history be damned, we're in an alternate world. But of course, comic books deal with continuity. And so they can't ever, Marvel could never really write a mainstream continuity story where Captain America single-handedly ends World War II and saves all the Jews and prevents the Shoah from happening. Similarly, DC can't produce a mainline continuity comic at this point where Superman liberates every camp and saves millions of Jews who otherwise would have died, because like history is history at this point.
Right. Well, I guess it's lucky for Marvel and DC that Captain America was frozen before the war ended, and for DC they just restarted time a couple more times.
Right. But as you said, the Justice Society, our eyes on you. Why weren't you doing more?
Right. I mean, to the credit, they were known as the Mystery Men. I think they also did more secretive things. But anyway, I did want to say there is another thing that's actually was pretty controversial. About 7 years after this, 1998, and I remember I was in high school when this came out. The 4 Superman books did a storyline where each one was doing a sort of a stylized sort of story of a different era of Superman. And Louise Simonson and John Bogdanov in the Man of Steel books, issues 80 to 83, did a story where Superman was transported to what appears to be the Warsaw Ghetto and Holocaust, but there is no mention of Jews. And and what's interesting about the issues is Bogdanov drew them in the style of Joe Shuster, and it's spot on. It's unbelievable. But there's just no mention of these people that he's saving or interacting with. It's a similar story to the one Jerry Ordway wrote in Superman 54, but there's just no mention of Jews. And this was a huge deal when it happened. You know, if Twitter had existed, forget it. But like, people were very mad. I remember, just a personal story, I remember being in shul on Shabbat, and the rabbi who the rabbi that I grew up with, he was very interested in media and TV and movies and Jewish portrayal and those things. He would write a column of like reviews for things, movie reviews for things. He came up to me in shul and he's like, "Did you hear about these Superman comics?" And I was like, "Yeah, I have them, of course. I'm reading them." He's like, and he sort of like not attacked me, but was sort of like not blaming me, but it's like, "You're the person I know that loves Superman. How could this happen?" You know, they're not even mentioning the Jews. And I remember feeling like strangely, like I had to defend Superman as a comic book, but I also was outraged by it. So it's strange. And, you know, looking back at those, so I would, you know, I'm curious what people think of these now. And I would love to get more of a story from, you know, Wheezy and Bog about that. It seems like it would be a DC editorial thing. That's what I'm assuming, like a Warner Brothers, like, you can't do that kind of thing, which is, you know, has roots in anti-Semitism as well. You know, not talking about the Holocaust or Jews specifically as the victims. So I just wanted to mention that. I think, you know, I don't want to end this coverage of Superman on a negative note, but I guess this is to say that there's more Superman stuff out there. There is nothing in great length and depth, and of course, please check out Is Superman Circumcised? You can read every reference, both explicit and implicit, about Superman in Judaism. But I just wanted to mention that you know, there were 3 other issues that kind of had something Jewish adjacent.
Yeah, and I mean, as we know, there's Jewish adjacency in a lot of comic books, and there's just an added power when they get explicit. That's been our thesis throughout this podcast from the beginning, and it's nice to see it completely borne out. And sometimes those comics are heart-wrenching and tragic, as we saw today with Supergirl, and sometimes they're just the delight of seeing Superman in a kippah joining his coworker for Shabbat dinner. And it's always fun to be able to dive into these and to discover what there is. We've got a couple different ideas for where to go next. So we're really hoping, listeners, that you will enjoy it. We should be getting it to you, hopefully not too late from now. Thank you for listening. As always, we've loved getting to have this super good time with you. And until next time, I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No relation.
You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Jewish Comics Pod, or you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.